They said the Bronx had two kinds of kids back in the early 1900s, the ones who ran errands for the butcher and the ones who ran from the cops. Arthur Flegenheimer didn't much like either job, but he found himself doing both before he hit his teens. His world was loud, dirty, and unkind, a place where tenement walls sweated in the summer and froze solid in the winter. If you didn't learn how to take what you needed, you didn't last long. He was born in 1902, to a family that had come from Germany chasing the promise of America, that shining idea that anyone could rise if they worked hard enough. But for the Flegenheimers, that dream curdled fast. Arthur's father, Herman, struggled to keep steady work. His mother, Emma, did what she could, cleaning houses, sewing clothes, raising her children in a cramped apartment that smelled of coal smoke and cabbage. Arthur saw the look in her eyes every night when she counted pennies on the kitchen table, the quiet panic of a woman who knew it still wouldn't be enough. And that's when it started, that burning inside him, that need to be somebody, not just another broke immigrant boy hustling for scraps. He wanted more. He wanted respect. He wanted power. He started small, stealing coins from delivery routes, running errands for the street toughs who ran the corners, learning how to keep his head down while keeping his ears open. The Bronx back then was crawling with gangs. Italians, Irish, Jews. It didn't matter where you came from, only how far you were willing to go. Arthur wasn't the biggest kid, but he had something the others didn't. He was mean when he needed to be. Quick to throw a punch, quicker to hold a grudge. By 14, he dropped out of school. The classroom couldn't teach him what the streets could. How to read a man's intentions by the way he looked at you. How to slip a pocket without getting caught. How to talk tough enough to make the other guy blink first. Those lessons stuck. They hardened him. They gave him an edge. But then something happened that changed everything. One morning, Arthur woke up to find his father gone. No goodbye, just vanished. Some said Herman couldn't handle the pressure of providing. Others said he'd run off with another woman. Whatever the truth was, it left a hole in Arthur that never closed. He hated his father for leaving, but deep down he feared becoming him, weak, forgotten, powerless. That fear would follow him for the rest of his life. Without a man in the house, Arthur became the man. He started taking odd jobs, shoveling coal, loading trucks, sweeping factory floors. He'd come home each night covered in soot, exhausted, his hands raw. But every paycheck went straight to his mother. She'd smile and thank him, proud of her boy. What she didn't know was that Arthur was making extra money, on the side, the kind that didn't come with a paycheck. He ran with a crew of street kids who boosted goods off delivery trucks and sold them out back to shopkeepers. At first it was petty stuff, cigarettes, sugar, soap. But then one day, Arthur got caught. A truck driver spotted him trying to lift a crate and knocked him flat. The cops showed up, and just like that, he was sent to a juvenile reformatory. For most kids, that kind of place would have scared them straight. But not Arthur. He learned something important there, how crime could be organized. Inside those walls he met older boys who talked about the real money, the kind you made in the shadows. They taught him how to plan, how to keep quiet, and most importantly, how to get even. When he got out, he wasn't the same. The boy from the Bronx was gone. What came back was colder, sharper, and hungrier. He started calling himself Dutch, a nickname born from his German roots. And just like that, Arthur Flegenheimer began to fade from existence, replaced by a man who would one day make the whole city say his name with both fear and admiration. Dutch found his first taste of real work in a nightclub. He wasn't old enough to drink, but he was smart enough to collect debts. The owner liked the kid's nerve and gave him small jobs, running numbers, collecting cash, sometimes persuading customers to pay what they owed. He was good at it, too. Not because he was the strongest, but because he didn't flinch. People said Dutch had a stare that could slice through glass. It wasn't loud or flashy like some of the other gangsters. It was quiet, cold, and unrelenting. That look made people nervous. And in a city where fear was currency, Dutch was learning how to spend it wisely. Then came the Volstead Act, Prohibition. Suddenly, every bar in America was illegal, and when something is illegal, someone's going to find a way to sell it. For Dutch, that was the moment everything clicked. Liquor was the new gold. If he could control the flow, he could control the city, but that was still a few years away. For now he watched, waited, learned. The underworld of New York was shifting. Men like Arnold Rothstein, Lucky Luciano, and Meyer Lansky were building empires out of booze, gambling, and vice. Dutch saw them not as heroes, but as blueprints. He didn't want to follow in their footsteps. He wanted to outwalk them. In those years before his rise, Dutch worked for a man named Joey Noe, a small-time gangster with a big-time vision. Noe ran speakeasies in the Bronx and Harlem, and he needed muscle. Dutch was that muscle. Together they started building routes, paying off cops and running beer through the city like it was water. But Dutch never forgot where he came from. The Bronx was still his kingdom, and he protected it with brutal efficiency. When someone tried to hijack one of Noe's trucks, Dutch didn't just retaliate, he made an example. He tracked the man down, cornered him, and beat him so badly that word spread fast. You didn't cross Dutch Schultz and live to brag about it. He was young, maybe 20, but already feared. Not because of his size, but because of that quiet, calculated rage. He could smile one minute and explode the next. His temper was infamous, unpredictable, and volcanic. But beneath that fury was a strange kind of logic. Dutch didn't lash out blindly. He made sure every act of violence meant something, that it sent a message. People began to talk. They said the kid from the Bronx was going places, that he had the makings of a kingpin, and maybe he believed it too. He'd walk through the streets of New York, watching the cars roll by, the lights flicker, the city pulsing like a living beast, and he'd whisper to himself, "Someday this will all be mine." There was something poetic about it. In a twisted way, a poor German boy, born to a broken home, destined to become one of the most powerful bootleggers the city had ever seen. But at that point, he didn't know the cost. He didn't know that every dollar he made would buy him another enemy, that every bar he opened would draw another set of eyes. All he knew was that he was done being poor, done being powerless. The streets that once kicked him down would soon bow to him. In the years ahead, the name Dutch Schultz would echo through the city like a warning. But it all began here, in the soot-stained alleys of the Bronx, with a boy who wanted more than life ever offered him. A boy who learned early that in a world ruled by corruption and greed, you either take what you want or die waiting for someone to give it to you. Dutch chose to take it. And New York would never be the same. When Prohibition swept across America like a storm in 1920, the law may have dried up the bars, but it couldn't quench the country's thirst. For Dutch Schultz, it was as if the world had suddenly turned into an open vault, one waiting for the right thief to figure out the combination. Beer, whiskey, gin, they all became treasures hidden behind locked doors, guarded not by police, but by opportunity. And Dutch had the ambition, the nerve, and the cruelty to seize it. He started small, working under Joey Noe, a man who had vision but lacked the fire. Together they ran beer through the Bronx in battered trucks, bribing cops with envelopes stuffed full of cash and cutting deals with local bar owners who wanted to keep the taps flowing. At first it was just survival. But soon Dutch realized something. He wasn't just moving alcohol. He was building an empire. Each delivery route was a lifeline, each bartender a soldier, and each rival gang an obstacle to be removed. Dutch's operation grew with precision, ruthless, methodical, unstoppable. He took over the Bronx street by street, buying off the ones he could, breaking the ones he couldn't. His men respected him out of fear, not loyalty. But Dutch didn't care. Loyalty was fickle. Fear was reliable. He began dressing the part, fine suits, silk ties, polished shoes. He walked into clubs like a man who owned the floor beneath his feet. There was something magnetic about him, a mix of raw violence and sharp intellect. He wasn't loud like some of the other gangsters. He didn't need to be. His silence said enough. When Dutch entered a room, conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes averted. Even his allies found themselves treading lightly. Joey Noe was the closest thing Dutch ever had to a friend, and for a while, they made a perfect team. Noe handled the business side, the books, the bribes, the logistics. Dutch handled the muscle. Together, they built a bootlegging network so efficient that even seasoned gangsters took notice. Their beer flowed like rivers through the Bronx, into Harlem, and eventually into Manhattan itself. But New York was crowded with wolves. And not everyone was happy about Dutch's rise. Rival crews began targeting his trucks, hijacking his shipments, intimidating his bar owners. That's when Dutch decided it was time to make a statement. He didn't send warnings. He sent bodies. Within weeks, the hijacking stopped. The Bronx belonged to him, and the city began whispering a new name for the young mobster, the beer baron of New York. His reputation spread like wildfire. Newspapers called him a gangster with the face of a banker. Detectives called him a headache. Politicians called him a nuisance. But on the streets they called him untouchable. Dutch was pulling in hundreds of thousands a week, enough to drown the Great Depression in champagne. He opened more speakeasies, expanded into Harlem, and started paying off bigger names in law enforcement. Cops who once tried to arrest him now stood guard at his bars. Dutch didn't just want money. He wanted control. And to get that, he needed to move beyond muscle. So he built a system, a clockwork machine of bribery and intimidation. Truck drivers, warehouse owners, bartenders, and city inspectors all played their part. He paid them just enough to keep them loyal, and scared them just enough to make sure they stayed that way. But with success came ego, and ego invited enemies. One night, while leaving a nightclub on Broadway, Joey No was ambushed by rivals. Dutch got the call minutes later. By the time he arrived, Joey was bleeding out on the sidewalk, barely conscious. He died the next day. That loss carved something dark into Dutch's heart. Joey had been the cautious one, the voice of reason. Without him, there was no balance, only rage. Dutch's revenge was swift and brutal. The men responsible were hunted down one by one. Some were shot in their sleep. Others vanished, their bodies never found. When the killing was done, Dutch didn't feel relief. He felt emptiness, the kind that made him realize he no longer needed anyone. From that point forward, Dutch ruled alone. He tightened his grip on the Bronx, turning every bar and brewery into his personal fortress. His men worked around the clock, running beer through underground tunnels and fake delivery routes. The city's thirst kept him rich, and his paranoia kept him alive. He began carrying a gun everywhere, slept with his back to the wall, and trusted no one, not even the men who toasted his name. The press loved him. He became a symbol of the glamorous outlaw, sharp suits, fast cars, endless cash. But those who worked for him saw something else. They saw the flicker in his eyes when someone disobeyed an order. The way he'd smile just before snapping. That smile could turn a crowded bar silent in an instant. It wasn't just about business anymore. Dutch had begun to enjoy the fear. Then came a problem he couldn't shoot his way out of: taxes. The government had started cracking down on bootleggers who flaunted their wealth, and Dutch was high on that list. He'd built his empire on illegal liquor, and Uncle Sam wanted a cut. Federal agents began circling, digging through his books, raiding warehouses. Dutch laughed it off at first, calling them pencil pushers, but deep down he knew this was serious. He tried to play it smart. He moved his money around, opened shell companies, and paid off tax collectors. But the IRS wasn't like the street gangs he'd crushed. They didn't scare easily, they didn't bleed, and they were patient. Still, Dutch wasn't slowing down. If anything, he doubled his operations. Harlem was now under his control, and he ran the beer trade like a war general. His men drove trucks painted with fake company logos, each route timed down to the minute. Every bottle of beer that hit a table in uptown Manhattan had his fingerprints on it. He also began to diversify: gambling, numbers, protection rackets. The more the city grew dependent on vice, the deeper Dutch dug his claws in. He became less of a man and more of a shadow, a name whispered in the back rooms of bars, a myth that terrified small-time crooks. But even legends have limits. Dutch's temper, always dangerous, began to spiral. He beat one of his men so badly for losing a shipment that the man couldn't walk for months. Another time, he ordered the death of a bartender who'd shorted him $50. $50 to a man worth millions. The violence wasn't business anymore. It was pleasure, and that's when the other bosses began to take notice. The likes of Luciano, Lansky, and Costello saw Dutch as unpredictable, a liability in a business built on quiet cooperation. The underworld was evolving, shifting toward a more organized syndicate model. Dutch didn't fit that mold. He was too wild, too loud, too uncontrollable. But none of that mattered to him. Dutch saw himself as untouchable, a self-made king who didn't answer to anyone. And in a way, he was right. For a brief, shining moment, he ruled one of the most profitable territories in America. He had mansions, fleets of cars, walls lined with cash. The boy who once scraped coins off the Bronx sidewalks now ate in private clubs where senators drank his beer in secret. Yet the cracks were already forming. His enemies were multiplying, his allies turning cold. Every success made him more paranoid. He began wiretapping his own men, testing their loyalty with false rumors. The tension in his organization grew like a ticking clock. Still, Dutch pushed forward, drunk on his own legend. He was no longer Arthur Flegenheimer, the poor kid from the Bronx. He was Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of New York, the man who beat the system, the king of the underworld. And for now, he truly believed nothing could bring him down. What he didn't know was that the same ambition that built his empire was already plotting its collapse. By the mid-1930s, Dutch Schultz had done the impossible. He had turned beer into a kingdom. Every glass poured in a Bronx speakeasy, every bottle that clinked in a Harlem basement, carried a trace of his reach. His men were everywhere: bartenders, drivers, fixers, even policemen who suddenly found their loyalty more profitable than their badge. Dutch had transformed crime into business, and business was booming. He wasn't just another bootlegger anymore. He was a tycoon in a tailored suit, a self-made monarch of the underground. He spent his nights in smoky jazz clubs, listening to saxophones wail beneath the flicker of candlelight, always seated where he could see the door. There was an aura around him, something magnetic yet menacing. When he spoke, people leaned in. When he smiled, they relaxed just enough to forget they were sitting beside a man who could end them with a nod. Dutch's empire was built on beer, but it ran on fear. He understood the psychology of power better than any politician. He paid his men just enough to feel lucky, but not enough to ever feel secure. He let rivals breathe just long enough to think they might survive, then crushed them when they least expected it. The beer baron of New York wasn't just a name, it was a warning. But with power came attention. The newspapers adored him, painting his face on front pages as the king of the Bronx booze trade. He despised it. Dutch wanted control, not fame. Fame was a spotlight, and spotlights attract heat. The federal government was watching, and so were the men from the other side of the city, the Italian mob. They had tolerated Dutch because he brought in money, but now he was expanding too fast, muscling into territories that weren't his. The tension was like a drumbeat under the city's hum. Rumors spread. Dutch had started making moves in Manhattan, buying influence where Italians ruled. The five families were consolidating power under Lucky Luciano, who was working to create a national crime syndicate, a network built on order, structure, and quiet profit. Dutch was the opposite. He was chaos wrapped in fine silk, unpredictable and loud, unwilling to play by anyone's rules but his own. He was making enemies faster than he could count them. And he didn't care. One night, sitting in a back room at one of his Harlem clubs, Dutch slammed his fist on the table, sending a glass tumbling. "They think they can run this city without me?" he snarled, eyes burning. "Let's see how long they last without beer." His men, half drunk and half terrified, nodded quickly. They knew better than to challenge him when he was like this. His temper had grown worse, his paranoia deeper. He stopped trusting the people who had built his empire. He began testing them, sending them on errands just to see if they came back, feeding them false information to measure who leaked what. Each betrayal, real or imagined, was punished with brutality. One man, suspected of pocketing cash from collections, was found dangling from a meat hook in a warehouse. Dutch didn't even deny it. "Let that be a lesson," he said coldly. But violence was only half his weapon. The other half was charm, sharp, polished, and used like a blade. He could flatter a police captain into silence, convince a judge to forget a warrant, or make a rival feel like an ally, until the knife came out. He played the city like a game of chess, every move daring and precise. For a time it worked. The speakeasies flourished. His breweries ran at full tilt. Money poured in so fast that his bookkeepers couldn't count it quick enough. He bought mansions upstate, filled them with art, cigars, and secret tunnels. He kept lovers in different boroughs and enemies in shallow graves. And yet, beneath the success, Dutch was restless. It wasn't enough to own the Bronx. He wanted Manhattan, the beating heart of New York. But stepping into Manhattan meant stepping into Luciano's world, a world that didn't tolerate chaos. Luciano's men warned him to stay in his lane. Dutch ignored them. He sent trucks across the Harlem River, disguised as bakery deliveries packed with beer destined for uptown nightclubs. He bribed doormen, paid off barkeeps, and whispered to investors who were tired of paying the Italians' cut. He wanted it all. The lights, the glamour, the control. Then came the raids. Federal agents began hitting his warehouses one by one, seizing trucks, confiscating beer, hauling his men off in handcuffs. Dutch saw red. Someone had talked. The IRS had been building a case against him for tax evasion, just like they had done with Al Capone. Dutch mocked the comparison at first, saying they can't hang a man for making people happy. But the laughter faded quickly when he realized the feds weren't backing down. He hired the best lawyers money could buy and walked into court wearing a custom-made suit, smirking like it was all a joke. And for a while it was. The jury couldn't agree. He bribed witnesses, intimidated others, and played the part of the humble businessman unfairly targeted by overzealous agents. The case dragged on for years, but underneath the legal theatrics, Dutch was unraveling. The pressure gnawed at him. He drank more, slept less, and began to see conspiracies everywhere. He accused his accountants of stealing, his drivers of betrayal, even his lawyers of plotting against him. His office became a fortress, filled with guns and locked drawers. The once sharp mind that built an empire was now clouded with suspicion. When he was acquitted after his first trial, Dutch threw a massive party, champagne, jazz, and endless celebration. But even in victory, he was hollow. The feds weren't done. They were coming back with another case, another courtroom, another chance to put him away. And Dutch knew that this time, they might actually win. That's when he made a fateful decision, one that would mark the beginning of his end. He called his closest men into a smoky back room and laid out a plan that made their blood run cold. "I'm going to kill the prosecutor," he said flatly. The room fell silent. They thought he was joking. He wasn't. Dutch Schultz wanted Thomas Dewey, the crusading prosecutor who had built his career on taking down gangsters, dead. It wasn't business anymore. It was personal. Dutch saw Dewey as the symbol of everything that stood in his way: law, order, and the limits of fear. He was convinced that if he could remove Dewey, he could scare the system into leaving him alone. But the others weren't so sure. The Mafia Commission, led by Luciano and Lansky, had been working hard to keep the peace between the city's criminal factions. Killing a high-profile prosecutor would bring the full weight of the government down on everyone. Dutch's plan wasn't just reckless, it was suicidal. When word reached the commission about Dutch's intentions, they acted fast. A meeting was held in secret, deep in the heart of the city. The verdict was unanimous. Dutch Schultz had to go. But Dutch didn't know that yet. He was still plotting Dewey's assassination, convinced that he could outthink everyone. He sat in his office, maps and photographs scattered across the table, barking orders while his men exchanged uneasy glances. The empire he built was starting to crumble from the inside. But Dutch was too blinded by rage to see it. He had become a king in his own mind, a man who thought he could rewrite the rules of both the underworld and the law. But kings who refuse to see the cracks in their crowns are the ones who fall the hardest. And in the autumn of 1935, as the leaves turned and the chill of winter crept into the city, Dutch Schultz's empire stood on the edge of ruin. The same ambition that lifted him from the gutters of the Bronx was now driving him toward the grave. He just didn't know how close he was. The walls had begun closing in on Dutch Schultz long before he realized it. To him, the danger still looked like opportunity, something he could outshoot, outthink, or outspend. But New York had changed. The days of wild bootleggers and street wars were fading, replaced by a more silent, structured kind of power. The commission, led by Luciano and Lansky, was building something new, a machine that ran on order, profit, and cooperation. And in that new world, Dutch was a problem. He couldn't see it, though. He thought of himself as the last true gangster, a man who didn't bow to anyone, who took what he wanted with his own hands. The commission's meetings, their rules, their hierarchy, all of it made him sick. "A bunch of politicians in pinstripes," he'd sneer. "They've forgotten what it means to bleed for this business." But while he scoffed, they plotted. After he announced his plan to kill Thomas Dewey, his men started whispering. They had seen Dutch angry before, violent, cruel, unpredictable, but this was different. He was obsessed. He spent days pacing his office, chain-smoking, muttering to himself about the government, about betrayal, about sending a message. He wasn't thinking like a businessman anymore. He was thinking like a man at war with ghosts. The commission's decision to eliminate him came swiftly. They couldn't afford the attention that would follow if Dewey was murdered. Dutch's death, on the other hand, would barely make a ripple. They chose their assassins carefully: Charles Bug, Workman, and Mendy Weiss, men who knew how to make an execution look routine. Meanwhile, Dutch had fled to Newark, New Jersey, setting up operations in a restaurant called the Palace Chop House. It wasn't much, a dimly lit joint with peeling wallpaper and the smell of burnt steak in the air, but it was safe, or so he thought. He brought his closest men with him: Otto Abadaba Berman, his accountant; Abe Landau, his bodyguard; and Lulu Rosenkrantz, his driver. They spent their days arguing, drinking, and pretending the world wasn't falling apart. Dutch was drinking heavily that night. He sat at a table in the back of the restaurant, his hat tilted low, a whiskey glass sweating beside him. The trial was looming, the pressure unbearable. His men tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes about Dewey, about the newspapers, about the law. But Dutch wasn't laughing. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He stared into his drink as if it held some kind of answer. Outside, the city buzzed with life, streetcars rattling by, people heading home from work, the hum of the night wrapping around Newark like a tired sigh. Inside, time felt frozen. The waiters kept their distance. Everyone in that room could feel something was off, the kind of tension that makes your stomach twist before you even know why. Then the door opened. Two men stepped inside, dressed like ordinary customers. They moved with the kind of calm that only comes from experience. They didn't rush. They didn't speak. One of them walked straight to the bar, the other drifted toward the back, his hand resting casually inside his coat. Dutch looked up just in time to see the flash of metal. The first shot tore through the air, followed by another and another. The sound echoed off the tiled walls, sharp and brutal. Dutch staggered to his feet, a look of pure disbelief on his face. Abe Landau lunged forward, reaching for his gun, but the next bullet caught him in the chest. Otto Berman collapsed beside the table, his glasses cracking as he hit the floor. Lulu tried to run, but didn't make it 3 steps. The room was chaos: gun smoke, broken glass, the smell of blood mixing with the scent of overcooked meat. Dutch stumbled backward, clutching his stomach. He'd been hit twice, once in the side, once in the gut. He fell hard against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting in a pool of his own blood. The shooters didn't wait around. They turned and walked out just as calmly as they'd entered, vanishing into the night before anyone could react. For a few moments, there was nothing, just the hiss of a gas lamp and the gurgle of Dutch's breath. He tried to speak, but his mouth filled with blood. The world tilted and blurred. His men lay dying around him, the empire they had built together reduced to silence and smoke. When the police finally arrived, they found Dutch barely alive. They carried him to a nearby hospital where doctors scrambled to save him. Reporters crowded outside, shouting questions. The great beer baron of New York had been gunned down in a dingy restaurant. It was the kind of story the press lived for. In the operating room, Dutch drifted in and out of consciousness. His words came in fragments, disjointed and strange. The officers by his bedside leaned in, trying to catch every syllable. What he said would later become legend, the so-called last words of Dutch Schultz. He mumbled about dogs and policemen, about beer and telephone wires. "Please don't ask me to do it," he whispered once. "I'm all right, Mother." His sentences made no sense, like pieces of a broken mirror reflecting bits of a shattered mind. Some said it was delirium from blood loss. Others said it was guilt clawing its way out. He lingered for almost a day, his body refusing to give up even as his life drained away. The doctors worked frantically, but the damage was too severe. One of the bullets had torn through his intestines, and infection was spreading fast. They tried surgery, but Dutch's heart couldn't take it. At 8 p.m. the next night, Arthur Flegenheimer, Dutch Schultz, was pronounced dead. He was 33 years old. News of his death hit New York like a thunderclap. The papers splashed his picture across the front page. Beer baron slain in Jersey shootout. Crowds gathered outside the morgue, curious to see the body of the man who had once ruled the Bronx. Some mourned him, others celebrated. The cops called it justice. The underworld called it business. The commission wasted no time dividing up his empire. His breweries, his routes, his bars, all were absorbed by Luciano's network. The Bronx, once his stronghold, was taken apart piece by piece until nothing remained of Dutch Schultz but stories and debts. His men were either killed, arrested, or vanished into obscurity. His fortune, rumored to be hidden somewhere in upstate New York, was never found. To this day, people still whisper about Dutch Schultz's buried treasure, a safe packed with gold and cash, hidden in the Catskill Mountains, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to find it. But what lingered most wasn't the money. It was the myth. Dutch had lived fast, ruled hard, and died young, the perfect outlaw's arc. He had clawed his way from the Bronx slums to the top of the criminal world, only to fall victim to the same violence he had used to rise there. The newspapers painted him as both villain and victim, a man consumed by his own ambition. In the quiet aftermath, as the city carried on without him, a few of his old associates met in dimly lit bars to talk about what had gone wrong. Some blamed the commission, others blamed Dewey, but those who knew him best said the truth was simpler. Dutch Schultz had destroyed himself. He couldn't adapt. He couldn't play the long game. In a world where cunning was replacing brutality, Dutch was a relic of another age, a man too wild, too proud, too unwilling to bend. And yet, even as his story ended in a pool of blood, there was something undeniably tragic about him. Beneath the violence and greed, he had been chasing something pure: respect, control, a sense of worth that life had denied him since boyhood. But power built on fear never lasts. It consumes its own. In the end, Dutch didn't die in a blaze of glory surrounded by enemies. He died in a cheap restaurant, bleeding out beside the men who had once called him brother. For all his power, for all his money, he left the world the same way he entered it, alone, angry, and misunderstood. And as his body cooled on the hospital bed, the city outside carried on, indifferent as ever. The lights of Harlem flickered, the jazz kept playing, and somewhere in the Bronx a new kid was watching, learning, dreaming of power, just like Dutch once had. In the weeks that followed Dutch Schultz's death, New York's underworld moved like a living thing, breathing, reshaping, and swallowing up what remained of the man who had once ruled the Bronx. His empire didn't collapse in an explosion. It eroded quietly, like sand after a storm. Bars that had once paid tribute to him simply stopped. Truck drivers who had carried his beer now worked for other bosses. His men, those few who survived, scattered like rats leaving a sinking ship. Some fled to Chicago, others to Cleveland. A few tried to keep the old operations alive, but without Dutch's iron will, everything fell apart. The commission made sure of that. They stepped in almost immediately, seizing every profitable corner of his business. Luciano sent men to handle the breweries. Lansky took the policy rackets. They didn't brag about it, didn't celebrate. To them, Dutch was just another piece on the board, removed for the sake of the game. But beneath that cold efficiency there was a quiet warning. This was what happened to anyone who didn't play by their rules. For the city, it was just another crime story. But for the men who had known Dutch, there was an emptiness they couldn't quite name. He had been brutal, yes, cruel even, but he had also been alive in a way few men were. When Dutch walked into a room, the air shifted. You could feel his presence like static before a storm. Without him, something vital seemed missing, replaced by order, calm, predictability. The streets were safer, but duller too. At his funeral, hardly anyone came. The undertaker said it was one of the quietest services he'd ever seen for someone so famous. A few old associates showed up, hats pulled low, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting a raid. Otto Berman's sister sent flowers, though she didn't stay long. There was no music, no speeches, no grand send-off, just the hollow thud of dirt on a wooden coffin. The priest said the usual words, though his voice trembled slightly, as if unsure whether he should be praying for a man like that. Afterward, Dutch's mother wept silently by the grave. She was small, frail, her face lined with years of worry. Reporters stood at a distance, their cameras clicking. She didn't speak to them, didn't answer questions about her son's crimes or his death. She only whispered something in Yiddish, placed a hand on the coffin, and walked away. The next day, the newspapers published her photo beside the headline, "Mother Mourns Beer Baron." It was the last image the city would see of Dutch Schultz's world. Grief, quiet, and dust. But death didn't end Dutch's story. It only gave birth to his legend. Rumors began to spread almost immediately, stories of a hidden fortune buried somewhere in upstate New York. They said Dutch had stashed millions in cash, gold and bonds inside a steel safe, buried it in the woods near the Catskills before his arrest. Some claimed he'd done it out of paranoia. Others said it was preparation for a future he never lived to see. Either way, the myth grew. Treasure hunters came from everywhere, prospectors, ex-cons, even curious locals. They roamed through the mountains with shovels and metal detectors, swearing they could feel the spot where Dutch had hidden his loot. None of them ever found it, but that didn't stop the search. Every few years, someone would turn up claiming to have a new lead, a map, or a confession from one of Dutch's old men. The money became a ghost story, something whispered over campfires, half believed, half hoped for. Meanwhile, the world Dutch once dominated changed completely. Prohibition was long over, the speakeasies replaced by nightclubs and bars that served legally now. The gangsters who had thrived on smuggling alcohol moved into other businesses, gambling, construction, narcotics. The chaos of the old days gave way to a more refined kind of crime, one that hid behind corporations and politicians. Men like Luciano, Lansky, and Costello thrived in that new world. They were the architects of a criminal order that would define the next century. And Dutch? He became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when ambition outpaced sense. Even among gangsters, his name carried a strange mixture of respect and pity. He had guts, they'd say, but no patience. They admired his nerve, his raw power, but shook their heads at his recklessness. To them, Dutch was the past, an echo of an era when muscle mattered more than brains. Still, his story lingered. Writers, filmmakers, and historians would later turn his life into something mythic. They painted him as the doomed outlaw, the man who defied the system until it swallowed him whole. They loved his contradictions, the boy from the Bronx who became a king, the king who fell because he couldn't stop fighting shadows. He was both the hero and the villain of his own story. One of his former runners, an old man by then, once told a reporter, Dutch wasn't crazy, he just couldn't let go. When he saw the world changing, he fought it with everything he had. That's what killed him. There was truth in that. Dutch's downfall wasn't just about greed or violence. It was about a man trying to hold on to a world that no longer existed. Years later, people still claimed to see him. A bartender in the Bronx swore Dutch's ghost haunted his basement. A farmer near Phoenicia said he'd seen a man in a fedora digging by the river one night. Others said the ghost wasn't Dutch at all, but one of his men still searching for the lost treasure. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. Dutch had become folklore, a symbol of the gangster who refused to die quietly. But behind the myth, the truth was simpler and sadder. Dutch Schultz had wanted to be untouchable. He thought money, power, and fear could make him immortal. Yet in the end, all he left behind were stories, scattered memories, and a hole in the ground. The streets he once ruled forgot him. The men who had sworn loyalty to him joined other bosses. Even the buildings he owned were torn down, replaced by new ones that no one remembered him by. And still, if you walk through the Bronx on a quiet night, past the old streets where the beer trucks once rumbled, you can almost feel it, the ghost of a time when men like Dutch ran the city. There's a strange energy in the air, a mix of danger and nostalgia. You can picture him standing there, hands in his pockets, hat low over his eyes, watching the lights flicker across the rooftops. For a moment, you can almost hear his voice, low and rough, saying, "Nobody ever takes what's mine. But time takes everything, even legends." Dutch's empire, his enemies, his friends, they all faded into history, swallowed by the endless rhythm of New York. Only his story remained, passed down through generations like a song. And in that story lies a truth that every man who chases power eventually learns. No matter how high you climb, the street always remembers where you came from. The last person to ever speak Dutch. Schultz's name in a police file did so in 1942. It was a detective closing out a cold case involving one of Dutch's former associates. He wrote the words carefully. Deceased, no further leads. That was it. A lifetime of chaos, ambition, and blood reduced to 4 simple words, and yet, somewhere deep in the hills of New York, under the roots of old trees and the whisper of wind through the pines, some still believe his fortune waits. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. But maybe that's the point. Dutch Schultz's treasure isn't gold or cash, it's the story itself. The mystery, the echo of a man who tried to outsmart fate and, for a while, almost did. Because in the end, legends don't die when the man does. They live in whispers, in the spaces between truth and memory. Dutch Schultz may have fallen, but his shadow still lingers, in every outlaw's dream of getting rich fast, in every hustler's refusal to bow down. He was the embodiment of a truth as old as the city itself. Power is never owned. It's only borrowed, and the debt always comes due.